If you're painting in watercolor, it's really important to understand two of the properties of each of the pigments that you are using. And that is whether or not they are transparent or opaque or somewhere in the middle, and whether or not they are staining colors that are pretty much permanent once you put them down, or whether they are colors that are non-staining that are easily lifted to get back the white of the paper. So I'm going to show you a very simple exercise that you can use with all of your colors that will tell you exactly where they shake out on the sliding scale of transparency and the degree to which they stay in the paper. Okay, let's talk about transparency first. Um, some watercolor paints are purely transparent, which means they have no white pigment in them. And anytime you put them over something, they make that thing go darker. Other pigments have a little bit of opaque paint in them. That means you can actually do a lighter stroke over a dark background. But the problem with opaque paints is they can very easily create mud. One of the things that creates that glow of watercolor is the fact that the light comes through the pigment, hits the paper, and then reflects back to the viewer's eye, almost like a stained glass type effect. Well, if you have opaque pigments in there, in particular if they get muddy, what happens is it prevents the light going through and hitting the paper. It just hits the opaque paint and bounces back, and that's much less luminous than the impact of transparent watercolor paints. Now, that's not to say they don't have a place, but you don't want to get in and be over mixing, over mixing, over mixing, because they can make all of the other colors that you're using go very dull and muddy. So the easiest way to determine where your paints shake out on this is to take a sheet of watercolor paper, just draw a very thick black stripe down the paper. Now, I've also written out all the names of the pigments on my palette, and I recommend you do that so it's easy to just go back and check. And what I'm doing is I'm going to mix a fairly thick mixture of the paint, and I'm going to just paint a stripe over top of the black line. And what will happen is any of the paints that are purely transparent, they are going to make that black line darker where they cross over it. Any of the paints that are opaque are going to make it significantly lighter where they go over the black line. And then some of the pigments that are semi-opaque are just going to make it maybe just slightly lighter, or they're not going to actually cause any change at all. And the degree to which it lightens that black line is the degree to which that pigment is opaque. So again, really important to understand because, like I say, opaque pigments can get us into trouble with mud very, very quickly. Whereas with transparent pigments, you can glaze over top, you can mix colors together almost forever without really getting into mud. Even though you get a neutral, it will be a glowing neutral. And the reason that is the thing that gives watercolor pigments that glow is when the light hits the paper, it actually goes through the transparent pigment, it hits the white paper and reflects back, which gives it kind of a stained glass luminous effect. Whereas if it's opaque paints, it actually stops, the light gets stopped by the opaque paint and just reflects back from the paint. So we don't have that glow of the light hitting the paper and coming back. Now that's okay in certain areas of the painting, but we don't want that to happen and get out of control, which will and can happen if you're not aware that you're using a opaque pigment. So really important to know this if you want to create glowing watercolors like the one that I have behind me here. Now, the other quality that's really important is to understand whether a pigment is staining or non-staining. Now, the staining colors, they dissolve basically like solution form into the water. And so they actually get absorbed into the cotton fibers of rag paper, which means that it's there kind of forever. You can't go in and just wet it with a brush and blot it with a Kleenex and get back the white of the paper. It's kind of there permanently. But with the non-staining colors, the pigment granules are a little larger. That doesn't actually totally dissolve in solution form. And so those granules of pigment sit on top of the watercolor paper. Now we can come back in and re-wet that area of paper and gently loosen the pigment with a soft brush and blot it with a Kleenex or paper towel, and it will give us back the white of the paper, or at least a lighter version of the paper with just maybe a lighter wash of the color showing there. And this is really important if you're painting in traditional watercolor where we don't use white pigment. all of the light is supplied by the white of the paper. And so you want to know when you're creating a painting and when you put a wash of color down or a stroke of color down, whether or not you are going to have the ability to go back in later and loosen that pigment and get back the white of the paper. So very important to understand whether or not your colors are staining. And here's a simple test to do this. I'm going to mask off these areas on the same sheet where I did the transparency test, and I'm going to leave two areas where I have the pigment showing. And in one of them, I'm just going to go in and very gently, with a soft bristle brush with clear water, just wet the page, gently stroke it, and then blot it with a Kleenex to see how easily it lifts. And then in the second area, I'm actually going to go in with a stiff bristled nylon brush, and I'm going to more aggressively try to loosen the pigment, blot it with a paper towel or Kleenex, and then see how much comes back. Now, when this is done and once it's dried, when I peel it off, I'll be able to see how much of the white paper I got back. And you'll see that with some of the colors, they're very staining and it's hardly any of the light comes back. In particular, any of the phthalo colors or Windsor colors. Windsor Newton calls all their phthalo colors Windsor. So Windsor blue is pretty much the same as phthalo blue. All of those are very staining colors. So you know it's very difficult to get back the white of the paper. You might be able to gently get a little bit of the light back, whereas other colors that sit up on top of the paper, it's very easy to go back almost to the white of the paper. And in the type of painting that I have behind me, this was done years ago when I was actually president of the Canadian Watercolor Society. And this painting was created with no pencil lines, all just starting with wet and wet washes of color and gradually pushing and pulling positive and negative shapes out of this to create this composition. And in many cases, I use negative painting to indicate the light against dark areas, but also in some cases I went back in and loosened the paint and got the light back. So again, doing this type of painting, it's very important to know with the colors you're using. Do I have the ability to go back and get the lights back? Or once I put a wash of color down, is it there permanently? And again, the reason this is important is sometimes you can have almost two identical pigments in terms of their hue, but one of them will be a staining color, but the other one will be easily liftable. So depending on the techniques you're planning on using in your painting, that's going to have a big impact in terms of choosing which pigments you are going to use, whether they're going to be staining or non-staining. So I hope you found this helpful. Now, while I'm on this journey of creating a painting to go into the book celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Canadian Watercolor Society, this book is going to be presented to King Charles, and it's going to have an original watercolor from each of the living past presidents of the society. While I'm doing this, I'm going to be in process mode. I'm going to be documenting the entire process, and you're going to see me kind of relearning watercolor and trying a bunch of different techniques as I try to recreate one of my snow scenes in watercolor. But I'm also going to be creating a series of watercolor courses, and when these are ready, we are going to do a pre-launch of the courses at a significant discount. So if this is something that you might be interested in, then I have a link in the description. If you click on the link, it'll take you to a form where you can give me your name and email. And when we do the pre-launch, you'll receive notice of it and you'll have the opportunity to purchase my watercolor courses at a huge discount. And that's going to include just basic watercolor techniques, an introduction to watercolor, many advanced watercolor techniques, as well as how to create these abstracted watercolors like you see behind me, as well as a course in painting portraits in watercolor, painting small landscapes in watercolors. There's going to be a whole series of courses. These are the things that I used to teach in person when I was very active as a workshop instructor back 20 years ago. So if this is something that you think you might be interested, click on the link in the description, give me your name and email, and when these courses are ready, you'll be able to get them at an enormous discount.